The cold wind howled through the streets. As James pulled his tattered coat tighter around his body, he sat on the edge of a worn-out bench, his hands cupped together, trying to soak in whatever warmth he could. The city was alive, cars rushing past, people walking by, lost in their own world. No one looked at him. No one noticed the man who had once been somebody, now reduced to just another face among the forgotten. James had been homeless for years. Life hadn't always been this way. He once had a job, a home, even dreams. But fate had a cruel way of turning tables, and now he spent his days moving from one street corner to another, hoping for a kind stranger to spare him some change, or, at the very least, a glance of human compassion. But tonight, something felt different. There was a strange energy in the air, something that made James more alert than usual. Maybe it was just hunger. Maybe it was something else. Then, a scream. James turned his head sharply toward the sound. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the honking cars and city noise. But then it came again. A child's scream. Desperate. Afraid. His eyes darted across the street, and that's when he saw it. A small figure struggling against a force much bigger. A child. A man in dark clothing had his hands wrapped around the boy's wrist, dragging him toward a van parked at the curb. It was happening so fast. People walked by, some turning their heads, but no one stopped. No one intervened. James felt his pulse quicken. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. His legs moved before his mind could catch up. He pushed through the people, his voice cracking as he shouted, "Hey, let the boy go." The man didn't even flinch. He yanked the child harder, almost reaching the van's open door. The little boy struggled, tears streaming down his face, his voice hoarse from screaming. James knew he had no chance in a fair fight, but he couldn't just stand by. His feet pounded against the pavement as he rushed forward, his body colliding with the man in black. They both stumbled, the kid falling backward onto the sidewalk. The man cursed under his breath. Clearly caught off guard, he threw a wild punch, but James ducked. Years of surviving on the streets, giving him quicker instincts. He grabbed the boy's hand, pulling him away as fast as he could. "Run!" James gasped, pushing the child forward. The man cursed again, hesitating for a moment before jumping into the van. Tires screeched as it sped off, disappearing into the night. James turned to the boy, his breath heavy, his heart still racing. "Are you okay, kid?" Tears filled the boy's wide eyes, but he nodded. His little hands trembled as he clung to James. It wasn't until then that James noticed something. This kid wasn't just anybody. The expensive shoes, the neatly pressed jacket. This boy came from money, a lot of it, and just as James was trying to process everything, another sound filled the air, a different kind of urgency. Sirens! A black car screeched to a halt just a few feet away, and before James could react, a tall man in a suit burst out. His eyes were wild, searching frantically, until they landed on the child. "Nathan!" The boy let go of James and ran straight into the man's arms. "Daddy!" he sobbed. The man held his son tightly, his face crumbling with relief. It took him a moment before he lifted his head and truly looked at James. There was something unreadable in his gaze. Confusion, gratitude, something else. James shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say. "Did you?" The man's voice faltered before he straightened his posture. "Did you save my son?" James swallowed, suddenly aware of how he must have looked. His clothes ragged, his face unshaven, the unmistakable scent of the streets clinging to him. He had no place standing in front of a man who clearly belonged to another world. James started, But before he could finish, security guards swarmed in, and soon everything became a blur. People asking questions, sirens blaring, the little boy still clutching his father's coat. And just like that, James was left, standing alone again, the weight of the night settling in. He shook his head, letting out a small breath, before walking back toward his usual spot, where the city never noticed him. He never expected anything in return. He never even imagined seeing that boy again. But the next morning, as James rubbed the sleep from his eyes, he noticed something strange. A small crowd had gathered near the street corner where he usually stayed. People were murmuring, pointing. He frowned, standing up, stretching his stiff limbs. And then he saw it, a Ferrari. Not just any Ferrari. A bright red, sleek machine parked right in front of him. Its engine silent, but its presence louder than anything else. And then a man stepped out. The same man from last night, Nathan's father. James felt his breath hitch. What was happening? The man walked toward him, his expression unreadable. He stopped just a foot away, and then, with a small smile, he pulled something out of his pocket, a set of keys. He held them out to James. James blinked. Surely this was a mistake. Surely this couldn't be real. But the man simply said, "You saved my son's life. Now let me change yours." And in that moment, everything James knew about his world, about his place in it, was about to change forever. James stared at the keys in disbelief, his mind struggling to process what was happening. A Ferrari. For him, this had to be some kind of mistake. His rough fingers hesitated before reaching out, but then he pulled his hand back. He had spent years being ignored, overlooked, treated like he didn't belong. And now, suddenly, a man, in a tailored suit, was offering him the kind of luxury he had only ever seen from a distance. He looked up at the man, Nathan's father. He had the kind of confidence that came with wealth, the kind of presence that turned heads. But right now, his expression was warm, almost gentle. "It's yours," he said simply. James let out a shaky breath. I can't take this." His voice was hoarse, uncertain. The man smiled, but there was something deeper in his eyes, something that said he had already made up his mind. "You saved my son's life. I don't think there's any price high enough for that. But this is a start." James glanced around, suddenly aware of the growing crowd. People who had never looked at him before were now staring, whispering. He felt exposed. His instinct was to walk away, to disappear back into the streets where he was invisible. But something in him stopped. Maybe it was the way Nathan was looking at him from the back seat of the black car, his small face full of admiration. Maybe it was the realization that, for the first time in a long time, someone saw him as more than just a homeless man. Still, the weight of reality pressed against his chest. "I appreciate it," he said finally, "but a car like this, I wouldn't even know what to do with it." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "Then how about a different offer?" He tucked the keys back into his pocket and gave James a knowing look. "Come with me." James hesitated. He didn't like feeling indebted to anyone, but something about the way the man spoke made him curious. This wasn't just about a car. There was something more. With one last glance at the Ferrari, James followed the man to the black car where Nathan sat. As they drove through the city, James couldn't help but notice how different everything looked from the inside of a luxury vehicle. He had walked these streets for years, but now, behind tinted windows, the world seemed distant, like he was seeing it from another life. They pulled up to a towering glass building, the kind of place James had never dared to enter. The moment they stepped inside, people turned to look. Some whispered, Others tried to act like they weren't surprised to see a scruffy man in a worn-out coat walking alongside their boss. The man led James into a sleek office with a view so high up the city below looked like a toy set. "Sit," he said, motioning toward a chair. James sat stiffly, unsure of what was coming next. "My name is Richard Hayes," the man said, finally introducing himself properly. "I run a few businesses, finance, real estate, investments, but none of that matters right now." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Tell me about you." James hesitated. No one had asked him that in a long time. "Not much to tell," he said after a moment. "I had a job once. Construction. Had a place too. Then things fell apart." Richard nodded, as if he understood. "And now," James sighed, rubbing his hands together. "Now I just survive." For a long moment, Richard didn't speak. He seemed to be studying James, weighing something in his mind. Then he leaned back. "I want to offer you more than a car," he said. "I want to offer you a job." James blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "A job?" Richard nodded. "You didn't hesitate to risk your life for my son. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. I need people like that. Honest people. Loyal people." James shifted in his seat. "I don't know anything about business." "You don't have to," Richard said simply. "I'll teach you." James frowned. This was crazy. Just yesterday, he had been sitting on a bench, ignored by the world, and now a millionaire was offering him a chance to step into something entirely different. It felt unreal. "I don't know," James muttered. Richard stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city. "You remind me of myself," he said after a moment. "Most people don't know this, but I wasn't born into money. I had nothing. I worked for every single thing I have now." He turned back to James. "I know what it's like to struggle, and I know what it's like when someone gives you a chance." James felt something shift in his chest. He had spent so long believing that people like Richard would never see people like him. But here he was, being given a choice. He looked down at his hands, rough, calloused, marked by years of hardship. Could he really change his life? Finally, he met Richard's gaze. "What would I have to do?" A slow smile spread across Richard's face. "We'll start small," he said. "I'll find you a place to stay, clean you up, get you settled, and from there, we'll see what you're capable of." James let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This was more than just a job. It was a second chance, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope. James couldn't believe how quickly his life changed. One day, he was sleeping on the streets, invisible to the world. The next, he was stepping into a new life, one he never thought possible. True to his word, Richard found him a place to stay, a clean, comfortable apartment that felt like a palace compared to the park benches and cold sidewalks James was used to. A new wardrobe replaced his old tattered clothes. A fresh haircut made him almost unrecognizable when he looked in the mirror. But the biggest change wasn't in how he looked. It was in how he felt. For the first time in years, he had purpose. Richard introduced James to his company, not as some charity case, but as a man with potential. At first, the work felt overwhelming. Meetings, numbers, contracts, things James had never dealt with before. But Richard was patient, teaching him the ropes, pushing him to think bigger. And James? He worked harder than he ever had in his life. He studied late into the night, took notes during meetings, and asked questions whenever he didn't understand something. Slowly, he started to catch on, but not everyone was happy to see him there. Some of Richard's business partners, men who had been in his circle for years, didn't trust James. They saw him as an outsider, A man with no background, no connections. You don't know where he came from, one of them had said, when they thought James wasn't listening. What if this backfires? James had heard those kinds of whispers his whole life. But this time, he refused to let them break him. He wasn't just proving them wrong. He was proving to himself that he was more than his past. Weeks turned into months. James continued to grow, gaining confidence, learning the business, and even making smart decisions that impressed Richard. But then, something happened that changed everything. One evening, James was leaving the office when he noticed something strange. A black van parked across the street, the same van he had seen the night he saved Nathan. A chill ran through him. He knew that kind of silence, that kind of presence. It wasn't a coincidence. He turned to head back inside, but before he could move, two men stepped out of the van, their faces cold and unreadable. "We need to talk," one of them said. James didn't flinch. "About what?" The other man smirked. "About unfinished business." James could feel his pulse quicken, but he kept his face calm. He knew what this was. The men who had tried to take Nathan weren't just random criminals. They had a plan that night, and James had ruined it. Now they wanted payback. Before they could make another move, a voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" James turned to see Richard standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. The two men exchanged a look, then without another word, got back into their van and drove off. Richard walked up to James, his eyes sharp. "You know them." James hesitated, then nodded. "They were the ones who tried to take Nathan." Richard's jaw tightened. "And they're still watching." For the first time since meeting Richard, James saw something new in his eyes. Not just the calm, controlled businessman. This was a father ready to protect his son at any cost. That night, Richard took action. He called in security, contacts in law enforcement, people who could ensure Nathan and his family were safe. James, however, felt something deeper. He had been given a second chance in life, but now he had to make sure nothing threatened the people who gave it to him. Days passed with tension hanging in the air. Then, one evening, as James was leaving the office, his phone rang. It was Richard. "Meet me at the house," he said. When James arrived at the massive estate, he was surprised to find Richard outside, leaning against the Ferrari James had refused all those months ago. Richard handed him the keys. "It's time," he said. James furrowed his brows. "Time for what?" Richard smiled. "Time to stop doubting yourself." He took a deep breath. "You saved my son's life, James, but you also saved something else. You reminded me that there are still good people in this world. People who deserve a second chance." James felt something tighten in his chest. He had spent years believing he was invisible, unworthy of anything more. But now, standing here, hearing these words from a man who had everything, he realized something. He had been given a chance, yes, but he had also earned it. He looked at the keys in his hand, then back at Richard. "I don't need the car," he said. "I just need to keep moving forward." Richard grinned. "Then keep moving, but do it knowing you're not alone anymore." For the first time in a long time, James felt something unfamiliar. Not just hope, but belonging. He had a future now, a real one, and he wasn't going to waste it.